We're going to try part B of that same problem now, which is definitely the more difficult problem. In this problem, we're given two lists of customers. We have a third list that's guaranteed to have all null pointer references. It's also guaranteed to have a length that is no longer than either of the other two arrays. And that's real important. That's going to make it a lot easier for us to avoid going out of bounds in this problem. So as we look at these customers, everybody's got a name, an ID number, and they can be sorted using the method that we wrote in part A. Our goal is to merge them into the result array and keep this order. So for example, Aaron would come before Arthur. Aaron would be the first customer. We know that Aaron and Arthur compare first because we're guaranteed that the two lists are already sorted. So like they said on directions, this is real similar to the merge sort. And this is the only problem I've ever seen from a released AP exam that even mentions merge sort. So in terms of what you're expected to know from this course, this is pretty much it. So the one trick I have highlighted here says customers who appear in both lists will appear at most in once result. That's going to be a little bit tricky. So if you could imagine after we compared Aaron to Arthur and we took Aaron and placed Aaron into the result list, we would then want to progress list 2's index to number 1 and make that comparison back to Arthur. First one's easy, it's 0 versus 0. But after that, we're going to have to kind of move through these two lists separately. So Arthur comes before Baker. At that point, we'd be comparing Baker to Burton. Baker comes before Burton. So Baker would take over index 2 in the result list. And then here's where it gets a little strange. So now we have Burton versus Burton. At that point, I could either take the Burton from list 1 or list 2, it really doesn't matter, and put them into entry 3. And we see that right here. What we don't see is a second case of Burton, and that goes back to that highlighted note. If they're in both lists, they're going to appear at most once. So at that point, we'll have to write kind of a special case where, again, it doesn't really matter which Burton we take, but we'll want to then cross off like both of those indexes and progress to list 1's index 2 and list 2's index 3. And that will only happen in the case when the two customers actually are the same. Keep in mind as we write this method, we're going to be relying on the method that we wrote in part A, which was called compare customer. In fact, the very first time that we use this method, as I mentioned, we're going to be using compare customer on list 1's index 0. That's a customer. Okay, and we're going to compare that to list 2's index 0. Now, the strange case is going to happen when that comparison value turns out to be 0. So you might want to handle that first or second. It really doesn't matter. If we handle it first, okay. Otherwise, what we might see is that comparison value might come back to us negative, okay, less than 0. That would mean that the customer in list 1 came before the customer in list 2, okay? That was the rule that we wrote together in part A. So if that were to happen, that means that I'd want to go into the result array at this index 0, and I would specifically want to use the list 1 customer, not the list 2 customer. And then at that point, I'd want to progress through list 1. So what I'm thinking is I'm probably going to need a special index to reference list 1, probably going to need a special index to reference the result array, and one to reference the list 2 array. So I don't know what to call these. Maybe we'll call it like list 1 index. We'll put it at 0. Okay, we could make a list 2 index and put that at 0. And then we could make a result index and put that at 0 as well. So then instead of like using these zeros here, it's going to be important that I use proper indexes. So right here, that would be list 1 index. Right here, this would be list 2 index, okay? And right here, that would be the result index. And then right here, one more. This would be list one index. Now at that point, since I've used up a customer from list one index, I'm going to go ahead and advance that on my own. I'm going to increment the result index as well. However, as this starts to progress, I'm seeing the need for a overall loop that's going to carry me through this process multiple times. And I think I'll go ahead and use that to progress the result index. So for this problem, I think what I'll do is I'll actually bring result index down to here and go ahead and set it up within the loop. I'm going to use that result index as long as it remains less than result.length. And then, as I mentioned, I'll go ahead and let the loop progress result index. Now, why did I choose to run the loop on result index, not list one index or list two index? Well, it's pretty easy. If this result array has length, say 5, then I'm going to want to make 5 comparisons. Okay, if it was length 10, I want to make 10 comparisons, 10 decisions. Every time the loop runs, I'm putting one customer into the result array until it's finished. And since they promised me that the length of this array would be no more than either of list 1 or list 2, I know that I'll never run out of customers from those 2 lists, and I don't have to worry about like any strange out of bounds situations. All right, back to where we left off. There is one third scenario. Okay, the third scenario would be that comp was positive. So I don't really even need to ask this question. It's the only other thing that could possibly happen. It would look exactly like this piece of code. However, we would be working with list 2 in connection with list 2's index. And the reason for that is that we'd have a positive comparison, meaning the customer on the right actually had the smaller number and came first within the array. All right, back to this sort of trick case, right? Remember, this is the one sort of exception. This is when we see the same customer in both lists. Now, that means that the customer that goes into the result array could be either one. It really doesn't matter. So if another student wrote this and they used list 2 in connection with list 2 index, that would be totally fine. It would behave the exact same way. The one sort of peculiar thing about this is that we're actually going to want to progress both list indexes. Since that customer was observed twice, I want to move to the next customer in list 1 and the next customer in list 2. And by doing that, I would avoid seeing, for example, this Burton customer again in either list, and I would move on to a new Burton versus Dillard. Okay, so remember the goal here is we want to see this result array fill up with customers in alphabetical order, break alphabetical ties by number, and we don't want to see anybody twice. So this is the array that my code produced. This is what it should have produced. It's the same example that was in the instructions. And we see that Burton 3911 only appeared once, followed by a different Burton. Alphabetical order was achieved, and when we saw a tie, it was separated by the ID number. So yeah, there's other things you could do here, obviously, but to me, this just seemed like a pretty easy solution. Again, let me know if you have any questions.